In my earlier discourses, I have framed and outlined the current problems within the US of financial difficulties that have arisen due to the China-America trade war. From some of you, I have received information that seems to suggest that I am wrong. I may be. When I predicted the slowing of the US economy, and I spoke of how Trump is pressurizing the Federal Reserve in America to lower the interest rates in what the Trump side and the Republicans call the booming economy. And I spoke of how rate cuts by the Fed have been instruments of battling recession. So there is a recession feared in the United States of America, due aptly to the wild tendencies. I spoke of how $21 trillion of governmental debt. I spoke of how $10 trillion based on corporate debt, nearly $2 trillion on academic debt. Huge debt. Well, the main indicator of the US economy now substantiates my words. The GDP has dropped from the predicted 3.5% growth to a lower figure of maybe less than 2.5%. That may sound like very little to the uninitiated, but in the United States this means a drop of vast quantities of wealth creation, and I think it substantiates, as I say again, that the economy is in early indications of being in trouble. Now, the way the Americans in the first stage thought of bringing down the heat in this trade war was one by trying to activate a semi-encirclement of China, creating a potential for conflagration in the South China Sea, and as usual, Japan and South Korea immediately rose to the battle, but North Korea, despite all the discussions and 3 summits, has not yet incubated against China. So a semi-success there, but with the new missile that China has created, called the aircraft carrier Buster, I think what would have been an important presence of the US fleet in the South China Sea does not hold the same threat perception. And another part of that ring, much lower, India and its allies have not been able to contain China as was supposed to be its honor-bound duty, and there was a bit of an alarm because 2020 and the presidential election is around the corner, and that will necessitate A, Trump's sorting out affairs which he can no longer leave under the carpet. The threat for him is not so much the 20-member opposition building in the Democratic forces, which bodes not too good for them. And in fact, they have to reactivate measures. So they've gone into phase 2 of the China containment policy and added the heat by creating serious matters in Hong Kong and have allowed it to grow beyond any perspective to the crisis at hand. Also, they are hotting up the situation for the BRI, what was also called the OBOR. And in that, $4 trillion investment of China must be laid to waste. And that indeed seems to be the swan song for China if it succeeds. I have complete faith and confidence in my Uyghur brothers in Xinjiang. But nothing happens without purpose. Nothing happens out of the blue, as they say. And Xinjiang and the need of the Americans to curtail that vision of Xi Jinping of China has become the second phase reality. I now would like to say that the stalemate in the Gulf, and with time running out for 2020, a second phase seems to have been launched in the lower end of OBOR, which is called CPEC in Pakistan, which of course needs some sort of attention in bringing Afghanistan to heal once and for all completely. That's why the enormous effort of the American thought process on the subject, and that had made Pakistan important, and Eureka, the current Washington signs that have been launched, which has given so much hope to Pakistan vis-a-vis American thinking. As far as I'm concerned, it would seem to me that the stalemate in the Gulf has accelerated the process. The obvious sign would seem to be the declaration of the BLA in Pakistan as a terrorist organization. But terrorism is a game that is played to the advantage of the achievement and target of the country playing the game. And we mustn't ever forget that. I keep saying to my friends in Pakistan that, and I said a few months ago in one of my talks, that for God's sakes, you're concentrating on Kashmir for the wrong reasons, and they're not going to play into your hand. You're concentrating on Afghanistan for reasons which are not going to be to your advantage. But when my friend Zalmay Khalilzad was sent to broker in the Taliban-led peace, in a point I had raised at the United Nations and have raised consistently, involve China, Central Asia and Russia, and perhaps it might be achievable, and that is what is being proclaimed to have been arranged. I would doubt it somewhat. In the recent visit to Washington, I have spoken twice, once a month ago, wherein I said there are 4 points to an agenda. Do not allow yourself to be distracted by India or Afghanistan. First, the 4-point agenda should list the removal of the American-inspired noose around our neck called FATF. It is within the ability, in a stroke of a pen, for Washington to have removed that noose around our neck, and I'm glad to see that for the past year, which was also there in the government that I was a part of, that results and strong advancements are made to try and stop and dry out Pakistan from being involved in duplicitous funding around the world. And that has stopped pretty substantially, I'm told, and has been acknowledged. But FATF still hangs around our neck, keeping us happily in the grey sector, not the black. If we went to the black sector, world trade would stop with us immediately, and there would be horrible repercussions. So the sword still hangs above our neck, and I'm sorry to say that the first of the 4-point agenda I raised has not been scrutinized and has not been mobilized for our removal from the list, whereas India still remains chairman of the committee to decide one way or another, but could have been removed with a stroke of the pen in Washington by the President of America. Secondly, to facilitate trade, I pointed out how minuscule the couple of $1 billion it would add to Pakistan's income if America opened up trade in the textile sector as it did with India and Bangladesh. But in India, they gave a $5 billion free trade agreement, which has just recently been decapitated, but was there for several years. How come Pakistan as an ally, as a friend, and through all? And when they came to us with the first Zalmay Khalilzad meeting, I said, this is what you should insist on as part of the quid pro quo in getting things moving for the United States. Didn't happen then, hasn't happened now, but it should happen. Thirdly, I spoke about how funding becomes a necessity, and I talked about how the ASEAN was given 1% of investment from retirement funds in America, which created the economic miracle in ASEAN. I said if they give us even 10% of what they gave ASEAN, Pakistan would be a booming economy. Well, so far, nothing, it seems, has emerged. I was hoping it would emerge. These are important points. Going there and being well photographed is not enough. Unfortunately, this was not taken on. Also, it would then remove the horrible cycle of 14 applications to the IMF to keep us going, and the scrutiny within the program of those funds being invested would not have allowed Pakistan to do a lot of the foolish things we have done over the years, like circular debt and many other such things, because the system wouldn't allow it and would be monitored. Instead, we went to the IMF. I remember that we had asked for much more, 14 billion, because it was estimated at that time for the next 3 years approximately 45 billion would be needed. I now believe they have reduced it to 38. And the first 14 billion was to be paid as installment by IMF, but not front-loaded. Not that you take away with one hand what you give, but would have been a development initiative, and one that would have made funding much easier, not taking up the Pakistan's crippled banking system to 12.5% as a basic rate, which is horrendously high. You will never have development in that rate. The fourth point I had raised was we must secure the solidarity, security, and the integrity of Pakistan, and the Americans must write down this commitment. I have yet to see anything happening on that count. We had, during the Russian involvement in Afghanistan, the infamous missile program, Stingers. How did Pakistan benefit? Maybe a few people did, but certainly not Pakistan. Similarly, at various times, various toys, a fleet of ships were given, then returned to the USA. And of course, we never got the lifeline support that we wanted. Also, things changed, as I say. The Kashmir issue now is not of real estate, it's of water divisions, and the encumbrances that are being brought upon it in flagrant violation of the Indus Water Treaty. I will not delve on that other than to say that very substantially the World Bank and IMF are influenced, as proclaimed by Secretary Pompeo, in terms of what they can get them to do and what they can stop them from doing. Well, here are things that are involved with it. What have we done about it? In terms of security, after the recent arrests at such high levels of government, I'm not surprised that the Americans are going hot and cold, pretending to be disinterested in the nuclear issue, or probably they have put it on a back burner. And the reason for that being, there has been so much leaked to them, I don't think they feel threatened anymore, but have achieved a level of containment that they wanted as a minimum requirement. But instead, we are now looking at other things. And I will take my next step by going to a person I read a lot. It is the Bangkok-based geopolitical researcher, writer, and special contributor to 21st Century Wire, Tony Cartolucci. And he also writes for the New Eastern Outlook, and of course is predominant in 21st Century Wire, specifically Pakistan Files. Now, he speaks of two areas in Pakistan, which he also compares to the Xinjiang Chinese Uyghur movement, and call it rebellion, call it social unrest, that you can choose the word for it. He says, and I quote, US interference in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is just as extensive as it is in China's Xinjiang. Islamabad has long accused Washington of funding and arming it, along with segments of the Indian government aligned with US interests. The credence to these accusations, he names, is the pro-Balochistan slogans raised during Imran Khan's address in the US, And India Today's article, 16 European Union members of parliament from 750 write a letter to Trump to intervene in Balochistan, as an example. He also goes further to say that the US is not directly arming and funding the BLA, but it is openly supporting pro-separatists amongst the diaspora, who even Stanford University experts admit are in turn funding the BLA. And I read to you from this document. The US move to designate the BLA as a foreign terrorist organization holds little meaning, he says. The BLA will find itself besides organizations like Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, which we all know are openly funded and armed by the United States, and a large cross-section of Washington's closest European Arab allies. Now that is interesting, what he says. And he is a recognized speaker on these subjects. He accuses the US National Endowment Fund, in short NED, and he says they're working hard in and against Pakistan. I hope people are listening to this. NED has directly funded and supported the works of the Balochistan Institute of Development, BIFD, which claims to be the leading resource on democracy and human rights and development, though it's meant to be a development fund. And he accuses the BFID by saying they are trained at NED BFID workshops and at its US aid-funded center. May kindly be noted. Then there's a question of media and the Voice of Balochistan, whom he claims that every top story is US-funded propaganda, including op-eds by US representatives promoting separatism, and foundation-funded Reporters Without Borders. Now this is very interesting. And the Soros-funded Human Rights Watch, with a direct message from US State Department. The founder of the Baloch Society of North America, Dr. Wahid Baloch, openly admits he meets with US politicians in regards to independence, as he considers Balochistan occupied by both the Iranian and Pakistani governments. And it gives Washington the perfect pretext, if it so does wish to do, to create an armed conflagration against either country, which have been planned and detailed, and I quote, by various US policy think tanks. In Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Voice of America Diva focused on Pakistan's Pashtuns, and it provides support while being based in Washington, D.C., not here, and do not admit the US funding organization like AdvoPark, regularly promoted by VOA Diva. It has a publication called Democracy Digest, interviews and defense of groups who appear to be funded by Washington and undoubtedly serve US interests in Pakistan. And then he speaks of Gulale Ismail, who is an NED fellow, and is widely touted as a voice for Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But the question that he raises is that both Xinjiang and these areas are settings for massive Chinese-led infrastructure and trade initiatives. Western publications like the Business Insider note the importance they hold in the CPEC and OBOR. US attempts to destabilize the region in turn directly impact the viability of the OBOR CPEC initiative, and as he says, it is to deny the economic wealth and influence it stands to grant Beijing. And by destabilizing this entire area, this corridor's full potential is inhibited. US-backed conflicts are fueled, he says, for a singular agenda, which is impeding China's rise and that of its allies, including Pakistan. In the end, he quotes something which is very interesting and perhaps one of the reasons for this interview. And there are people still in darkness and they just can't see the light. If you don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right. The repercussions for Pakistan have been made obvious. My 4-point agenda, which I have been raising for many weeks, merely says to all and sundry, for God's sake, see what is happening. Do what is necessary to be done for the rights of Baluchistan, of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and also of my province Sindh. Because within these are the germs that could create wholesome trouble for this country. And we don't deserve it. But the 4-point agenda I raised was to help stabilize our international trade, help bring in investment funding, regulated investment funding, which cannot escape scrutiny. And at the same time, remember that China has been a friend in needy times. It has stepped in. If by any chance it is accused that they have received more than they were due, well, these are the perils of funding countries that do not seek to work for themselves. We need to improve our own capabilities, our own investments. And by what is happening at the moment, perhaps we are not undertaking the best policy. Perhaps we've used the stick long enough. The carrot has to be introduced. Bring the political mainstream together by trying to talk of the potentials of what can be observed by frying Asif Zardari or Mir Nawaz Sharif. Look at it in terms of the current status within the country. Bring together a national understanding of what needs to be done by all to bring ourselves out of this quandary. And most of all, let us believe and work for Pakistan, and do that by fulfilling the requirements of our brethren in most of this country, which are living in very difficult times. Thank you.